I'll briefly introduce them. I'm Robert Sauter. I'm an adjunct here at NPSIA. We have a very high level of expertise. In the middle, we have Sheena Bell, who's a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto, Odoisi, and also is an expert on out-of-school children. And she has been very active with UNICEF, and she's a real expert, and she's going to set the stage for us and sort of the global picture of out-of-school children and some of the issues related to alternative ideas for inclusion of those children. Second, we have Dr. Leslie Casey-Hayford, who is an expert from Accra, Ghana, and she's got a fantastic research think tank there, Associates for Change. And she's also the principal investigator of a large 3-country study on education in Sierra Leone, Nigeria, and Ghana. And this has been funded by IDRC through the GPE KICS program. And I'm lucky enough to be an advisor on that program of research. And lastly, we have Tricia Wynn from IDRC. She's the program leader in the Global Partnership for Education, Knowledge, and Innovation Exchange. KICS is the best acronym I've ever heard of. And it really kicks. And she has been heading up a very interesting set of research projects. I would call them almost like policy research projects to examine in a concrete way, in an evidence-based way, the ideas for change and improvement and reform in education that are around the globe. I really like the KICS program because it has such a practical application. It's not, and I say this with all the respect to NPSIA, it's not idle academic curiosity. It's actually looking at some very important changes that are needed. So we have a terrific panel today. I just want to set us off on a little trajectory. I'm mentioning a couple of observations that I have about the education system globally. Sheena will talk a little bit about this, but we, I think, are at a static, if not a regressing point in education. We have maybe 250 million children who are out of school or not in school. Worse, we have children in school who are getting almost no education. We have fairly high participation rates in lots of countries. The number of children that are graduating from what in Canada we would call grade 7, so basic literacy, numeracy, and some other ideas that we would consider essential education, hardly any are making it. The quality is very, very questionable. And there's been a huge amount of research about this. I mean, it's a lack of teachers, it's poor infrastructure, it's distance from schools, it's lack of latrines, it's poverty in the sense of if you don't have a school lunch program, children can't come. In the past, we've had huge blockages to access based on school fees. And so, as probably most of you know, we have had a movement to eliminate school fees as a documented access problem for education. The end result is quite perverse because for many countries, all this meant was a reduction in the resources available for schooling. The government didn't replace the school fees, which came from families and parents. They just simply increased class size. And with a lot of perverse outcomes, one of which was teacher absenteeism. And anybody who's ever been in a classroom, if you've got a small group versus you've got 75 people, it is a huge change. And lastly, I think most concerning to me is a legacy problem with education, and that is a lot of the education that we see around the world, particularly in Africa, which I know a little bit better than other regions, is a kind of version of a colonial pedagogy, which is all teacher-based, talk, regurgitate, and it's a single exam at the end. So imagine studying for 7 years in all those terrible conditions, and it's all on one 3-hour performance. So this is bad pedagogy. It's a legacy from colonial times. It's seemingly unbreakable. The good news is, though, that as Leslie and others will tell us, there are alternatives that are being developed. There are some very impressive complementary, it has different names, complementary types of programs And Leslie has been very active in identifying those with the support of IDRC, and they are viable. She'll tell us more about them, but they have now the fundamental problem of how do you integrate these into the mainstream? How can we get country governments to take these on as part of their regular school system? They're documented to be effective. They're probably cheaper. And so there's a lot of interesting possibilities and potential there, but the uptake has not been satisfactory. Maybe complicating this is the reality that a lot of these alternative programs have been funded by donors through NGOs. And some of them are, we could call them indigenously developed programs. So locally devised ideas about alternative education. They're working well, but you know, in a very cynical sense, I would say if country governments are going to say, well, someone else is going to pay for it, the NGOs are going to look after it, I don't need to bother about that. I have enough other problems in the education system and enough funding pressures. Why would I take that on? So that is one of the fundamental challenges in front of us as educators. And so I will stop talking now and just to mention that we are going to have a PowerPoint presentation and we have a little technical glitch, so there's going to be a little up and down at one point, but let me call on Sheena to start us off.
Sorry, yeah, I'm fine. I'll just here and let it absorb. Okay. Can I? Yeah, that's so nice. This is a nice small group. Work together. Okay. Thanks, Robert, for that introduction. So yeah, my name is Sheena Bell. I'm going to be speaking briefly, kind of setting the scene for Leslie and Tricia on the area of out-of-school children. Prior to doing my PhD at the University of Toronto, I worked for 10 years at the UNESCO Institute for Statistics on out-of-school children and UNICEF on a variety of topics. So out-of-school children is really my bread and butter for my professional life, and I'm really happy to sort of frame the work today based on some of the key frameworks that have come out of a global initiative on out-of-school children. So Robert kind of primed us already for this discussion. So the speaker this morning talked about how during the NDG era, there was a lot of progress, and especially on universal primary education. You can see that between 2000 and about 2015, there's a strong decrease in the number of out-of-school children globally. But since 2015, there's been a stagnation. And at that same time, during the announcement of the SDGs, the ambitions of the Education Development Committee have actually expanded. And so now there has been this focus in international development around learning and improving learning outcomes. But we can see that out-of-school children are back on the agenda with school closures and disruptions, with COVID, with increased conflict, and climate migration. We know that in countries like in Afghanistan, with girls' education, in Gaza, there are 625,000 children out of school right now, that this is back on the agenda and more urgent than ever. So right now there are 244 million children ages about 6 to 18 who are out of school around the world, and the number of out-of-school children in sub-Saharan Africa is increasing. Within sub-Saharan Africa, there's a lot of variation in terms of the extent to which the systems are able to enroll children. So at the primary age level, about 6 to 11, some countries are able to achieve almost universal access, and other countries are still struggling to enroll even at the universal sort of primary education level. So the three countries that Leslie's going to talk about today, Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone, they also vary in terms of the share of primary age kids who are in school. So about 1 in 5 are out of school in Ghana, about 1 in 4 in Nigeria, and Sierra Leone has a higher enrollment rate with about 1 in 10 children of primary age not in school. But when we look to upper secondary age, so the SDG 4 now looks at universal pre-primary, primary, and secondary education. We can see that the whole region of sub-Saharan Africa lags behind other countries in the world around the completion of upper secondary education. So the question is sort of how do we help those systems actually achieve what is both a global priority, but also increasingly a national one as countries in sub-Saharan Africa make upper secondary free and compulsory. So what are some tools we have to help us understand this data, understand this issue? I'm going to talk about two tools that come out of the Out of School Children Initiative, which was a joint initiative by UNESCO and the UNESCO Institute for Statistics and UNICEF, something I've worked on in the last 12 years. So the idea then, and that's during the NBG period, was really to kind of that final push around universal primary education. And the idea was to bring together sort of expertise on data and statistics, understanding who's out of school, how many children there are, what ages they are, where they live, with sort of more of a local understanding of context and the barriers, that the reasons why those children are out of school, and policy analysis, and bring that all together into country and regional studies that then a combination of teams from local UNICEF offices, consultants, and lots of government agencies and representatives could come together, create these studies, and then use them to increase awareness. So in a lot of countries, because out-of-school children aren't in school, they kind of get forgotten. So school systems and Ministry of Education focus on who's in school. So these studies were really a way to raise awareness and say there's actually a lot of children who've fallen through the cracks. So how do we design better programs and supports to work with them? And so the project that Leslie's going to talk about is one of these kind of policies that these studies would promote. The first tool that comes out of the Out of School Children Initiative is that we can think, maybe of out of school children as sort of a monolith, but then how do we break this group down in order to design targeted policies to support these different children? So this is the 7 dimensions of exclusion, 2 more dimensions than I think the original had because of the expanded focus on upper secondary age. So it's this idea that we can first kind of break down the out-of-school children group by age group. So children aged 1 year before primary entrance age, sort of school readiness. Then you have the sort of classic out-of-school children groups, children of primary age out of school, lower secondary, and upper secondary. But what was unique about this framework was that it also tried to combine and make quantitative estimates and also policy responses around children who are in school but at risk of dropping out. So each study would kind of look at these different profiles and then sort of look at the particular makeup of the population in these different groups and the particular policies that would need to be targeted to these different groups. So let's kind of apply that then to the countries in Leslie's intervention. So we know that, in general, I've said that in sub-Saharan Africa, most children do not complete upper secondary education. So if we look at the upper secondary age group, so 15 to 17-year-olds cohort in Ghana, in rural areas, only 10% of them actually attend upper secondary education. So in fact, about 54% are still in lower secondary education, so they're overage for their grade, and they're still in school, but they've fallen behind. And quite a bit of them have also dropped out along the way. So how do we design, an intervention that can support these different groups, especially, you've got the overage kids, those are at risk of dropping out, and then you've got the kids who have already dropped out of the system. In Nigeria, you can see it's a bit of a different profile. So if they look at the 15 to 17-year-olds in Nigeria, about 34% never entered primary school at all. So again, a very different type of profile of out-of-school children. So different policies and barriers to be discussed for each of these different groups. Sierra Leone looks a little bit like Nigeria, with a larger percentage of 15 to 18-year-olds who have never been to school. But again, when it comes to where they should be in upper secondary age, it's only 1 in 10. So just the last tool that I want to talk about is that, okay, so we have out-of-school children by age groups, but out-of-school children have a range of educational experience. So as I mentioned, in Nigeria and Sierra Leone, there are adolescents who have never been to school. So the kind of policy you would design to support those children would be very different than the children who are 15 to 18-year-old, but they have dropped out in lower secondary. So they may have some basic numeracy and literacy skills and that kind of thing. So the global initiative produced this typology of out-of-school children by school exposure. And the idea then is you can further disaggregate these groups and then try to design different interventions, understand, what is the share in my country of out-of-school children by these different types of school experience? Who are they? Children with disabilities tend to be more in the never entered group, whereas, rural boys might be more likely to have dropped out at some point in their program. So this is data from the Ghana 2021 census, and this figure just basically shows that we, of course we can look at national level statistics, but when you start disaggregating by region and by district, there's a lot of variation. Some of the regions in Ghana that Leslie's program will be looking at focus in the north, and in these the out-of-school children issue is very acute. And in these areas, there's a high rate of the population who has never attended school, which is another important contextual factor. So, but in other regions, of course, there's a higher level of enrollment, and you might want to design your programs around that. So then we need flexible learning, because there's a lot of out-of-school children with a range of experience in education, range of learning levels. So this is a figure from the global UNICEF guidance on secondary education, kind of talking about these different sort of program modalities. The idea is that mainstream education, day school will fit and suit some children, but a lot of children face barriers that need sort of alternative modalities. That could be sort of remote education or flexible timelines, and then a variety of different sort of compressed or accelerated programs. So I'm going to leave that to Leslie to give us a case study on that. But yes, that's it for me. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the discussion after.
Thanks, Sheena. That was wonderful, because it's so nice to see the architects behind some of this theoretical understanding. I'm from Ghana, West Africa, but I originally was born in Ottawa here, Canada. I've been overseas for about 35 years, so bear with me. I'm coming from a bit of an African experience here, and I think it will be very interesting for us to have a lot of discussion on the topic. But generally, we want to thank IDRC and KICS GPE for this research we've been doing for the last 20 years in West Africa. This is sort of helping to crystallize some of the research, because governments in West Africa have been hearing about accelerated education programs, but now it's the time for investment. The question is, can governments really put their money where we need it? And in some cases, like Sierra Leone, there is just not a large budget to do that. So today we'll be talking a little bit about the state ownership and investment, and looking at the case of accelerated education programs and other types of modalities. Robert spoke a lot about the learning crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. I think we're all very aware that schools are failing children in terms of learning outcomes, especially foundation literacy and numeracy. I mean, it's not a big hit when a child is entering for 6 or 7 years. In Ghana's case, they may go through 12 years, but the equivalency is equivalent to our standard 6 years of primary education. So a lot of the quality indicators suggest that we're just not getting foundation literacy right in informal systems of education, particularly those in extreme poverty zones and those that are confronted with insecurity due to displacement, or in other cases due to war. So accelerated education and complementary basic education are systems of a second pathway. They're not formalized, but they're a second pathway for children to learn their basic literacy and numeracy skills in that context. There has been limited but a growing body of research around the impact of AEPs. The KICS IDRC research has been contributing a lot to that in West Africa, and we're helping governments devise policies, practices, and interventions that can support out-of-school children transition back into the system, or for the first time enter the system where needed. So some of the main focuses of our research have been on increasing the learning for children who are out of school through strengthening the use of knowledge and effective accelerated education programming and girls-focused programming, which I'll go through in a minute. And then to generate this knowledge and to support and capacitate governments to improve the context of uptake. So in cases where we have governments looking at new policies around out-of-school children, or designing legislation around out-of-school children, we have the cases of Ghana helping Sierra Leone and Nigeria do those two things. Our research was focused on 3 different types of modalities. One was the speed school, which you can consider in Sierra Leone to be the case, where it was a collapsed program of, instead of going through school for 6 years, the children in that context, Save the Children was doing that program, it was only 3 years. The complementary basic education model is working in Nigeria and Ghana. The Nigerians are a little further ahead because what they do is it's a second chance program where children have dropped out of school or they never were at school, but they now go for 1 year in mother tongue, learn their foundation literacy, and are transitioned back into the upper primary level system. Now, that program was devised in such a way that the Nigerian government certifies them. So if they go through 1 year, they go up into upper primary. If they go through 2 years, they go to junior high school. If they go to 3 years, they're into senior high school. It's a program that allows them, 8 to 15-year-olds, to learn to read and write in their local language and then transition into English language. The final program that we were looking at is girls empowerment programs, which the Bangladesh will, the BRAC program in Sierra Leone, and the STAGE program under the UK Girls Education Initiatives were being supported. And this one was also for foundation literacy, was provided, but it had a very large focus on income generation. So for teenage mothers and for children that, girls that had been dropped out because of issues around poverty and extreme poverty, they were in a cycle of poverty due to their, also their backgrounds, they were given income generation and what have you. And at the same time, foundation literacy was added to it. So that was another type of accelerated program we looked at. These are the 8 NGOs that we're working with across the region, and they've been our partners, innovators, including the Ministry of Education in Sierra Leone, because they had a post-Ebola program that was also a catch-up program for girls to transition back into school after 1 year. So in Nigeria, it's School for Life, or sorry, in Ghana, it's AfriKids, Gilbert, and School for Life, and then in Nigeria, at Kenham. These are national NGOs that stayed the course. When COVID came, we saw a lot of programs disappearing. Like in Nigeria, we would call up our partner, and sure enough, FHI 360 was closing down. Or we call up Sierra Leone, and then the UK government had just taken its girls' education financing. It was amazing post-COVID that the envelope for ODA was diminishing. And these countries that had been told commitment after commitment that they would never lose financing for education, sure enough, they lost it. And in the case, I'm a girls' education person, and I just couldn't believe in cases of Sierra Leone, where we were on programs that were just getting started to support girls a transition from these programs of income generation and foundation literacy. All of a sudden, the 3 million pounds sterling was disappearing. Basically, the journey for our research has been something like this. We're trying to think like policymakers in West Africa. And we know that the envelope for their financing is very small. But we know that the governments of these countries have to take up the bill. The donor sector is having fatigue. There's a level of fatigue in the donor sector in West Africa, and they have been financing these accelerated education programs for over 2 decades. DANITA, Canada, and others have all been supporting these programs, but in a fairly haphazard way. USAID comes in and comes out. When they see insecurity, they finance. When they don't see too much insecurity, they don't. And of course, there's other priorities. They've had to shift out to northern Nigeria, for instance. So we know that there is a need for government investment, even if it is not just symbolic, but is putting some support towards institutionalization of the process. So what we tried to do at the beginning of our research was that we started off with an understanding that we have to present the problem. And the problem and the numbers of out-of-school children, thank goodness, Sheena had put together the UNICEF model. So we were using that across the 3 countries systematically to measure the numbers of out-of-school children. But in these countries, the census was not available. So in most cases, policymakers were challenging us and saying, well, without these numbers, we can't do anything. So last year, luckily, Ghana's government and Nigeria, and a few years ago, we actually got the numbers. And there were twice as many as they had been in the MIT study, if any of you know the multi-indicator cluster study. So it's very critical. That first part of the discussion went on. Then we had impact and evaluations going on, impact assessments on the effectiveness of the models. So those 3 models that I put up, we measured the effectiveness from 3 perspectives: learning outcomes, the ability of resilience of the children to stay in the system after they were transitioned, completion and retention rates, and then their life outcomes, their aspirations and where they are. Some of them were still back on the streets because they had dropped out at junior high school and senior high school. These programs helped them complete primary. In most cases, the literature, it looks like it's about 80 to 90% of these children that go through the system are able to complete primary. But I'll be telling you in a few minutes what happened out there. Sheena's already spoken about the really increasing number of out-of-school children in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a poverty issue now. It's not an education solution alone. It's a holistic solution that's going to have to take place in sub-Saharan Africa to tackle the education crisis. The learning crisis in sub-Saharan Africa can only be tackled from a multi-sectoral approach. So the funding modalities have to be really clearly worked out with international donors providing frameworks so that they can all go back to that aid effectiveness agenda and really look and say, okay, if accelerated education is the second pathway for African children, how then can we construct that financial envelope? GPE, IDRC and others are really in a good position to do this, and it's so vital for us now. The civil society sector is waiting to support with government. Sierra Leone has a very good case of this. Now, I just wanted to mention 2 countries that are showing that there is a rising amount of, or a leveling off of the numbers of out-of-school children. But the numbers in Nigeria had increased from 11 million out-of-school kids to 19 million in the last 5 years. And that's due to the fact that the census data was not released until a few years ago. And that, of course, there's been an explosion of war and instability and displacement in Nigeria. So most children are out of school in IDP camps and in their own communities that are quite insecure. The demand, one of the interesting things that we found in the out-of-school story was that the demand and supply factors have not changed that much. One factor that has changed is the fact that children are on the move. They're leaving their contexts. So after they're 12 and 13, and there's a shift of responsibility now, in our sociological studies in Ghana, it shows clearly that children are now responsible for their own education. Once they finish primary, their parents say, it's enough, we now have to have you back on the farm, or you have to fend for yourself in the school system. And they're usually at junior high school level, and that's why you see the dropout. You see children trying to go to school on empty stomachs, unable to go to school because they don't have water, and it's 3 to 5 kilometer distances. And the same in northern Nigeria, where the burden of going to school cannot be supported just by the children alone. They need their parents to support, but their parents are unable. So then you have migration, short term that becomes long term. And in the case of Ghana this year, we'll be drilling down very deeply on the migration issue. We're going into communities this year to see where those children dropped out of junior and senior high school, and they're now on the streets of Kumasi, Tamale, and other parts of West Africa. So the demand and supply factors remain economic, sociocultural factors, parental transition, and then the effectiveness work. I think you can also read a lot about it. I want to touch on a few things about these programs. These programs have been studied for over 20 years. The evidence base is there. If you drill down into the literature, we know that there's a high transition. Once a child gets a second chance to go through 1 year of foundation literacy, they are so determined to go back to upper primary school, and their parents usually support them. Even though they were not the children in the family that were identified to go to school, the other children often in the family were, but these were the working children. These were the children in the family that were going to take care of the other children in the community and family. So there's a high transition of about 80 to 90% of those children go back to higher upper primary level. There's also very strong evidence of their learning outcomes, and we've done quite a few studies using SEGRA as well as EGRA, the early grade reading assessment. And we find that at least in reading outcomes, we see that children that have gone through 1 year of accelerated education compared to their counterparts that were in the formal system for 4 years They're almost at par in terms of what they can do in terms of reading, by letter, by word, and by paragraph. What changes a little bit is when the child is now reading a story, those that have been in school in English, and this was based on English proficiency. So the children that are coming from AAPs usually are very strong in local language, but this is a test that was done when they have been in school for 3 years. They've already transitioned back 2 or 3 years later. We are now testing their proficiency. Finally, I just want to mention one thing about effectiveness. We are now, with the frameworks that IDRC has provided, we've been really drilling down on the issue of girls' education. And it's clear that the sociocultural patterns that are there and the economic patterns of the reasons why child marriage exists have been changing. They've been shifting. Because girls are getting a second chance at education, they're now discussing and negotiating with their parents, are we able to go back to school? Are we able to go back to junior high school? And we have really clear qualitative data. We've just been presenting to UNFPA on this, and we're going to do a joint program to stop child marriage in the 3 countries we're working in, because AEPs are so effective in reducing that notion that the only option for girls is to marry. So again, there's a lot of evidence, no matter where you go, in terms of the learning outcomes, the transition back to school, the gender equality issue, and the empowerment of women. What's left now is the financing. Why are we not taking this on board as a government in these 3 countries? Why is it a marginalized issue? And it continues to be marginalized until the collective good of both development partners, pressure governments, use it as a lever and say, okay, until you finance this, we might not be able to fully finance the envelope we want to bring on board. The growing problem about school children is existing. It's now up to the dedication of governments to earmark financing. Now, I just want to get to the reasons why this has not been going on, and then there's a lot of other things, but I don't think I have very much time, do I?
Carry on.
Okay. I've lost track of how many minutes I've been up here.
Keep going.
Okay, good.
Great.
Okay. One of the questions we'd ask ourselves is why the government, and Robert alluded to this in terms of the issue around when donors and NGOs are financing something, the government's already tasked to do so much. But we can't deny the fact that marginalized children in the north of Nigeria, the north of Ghana, and in many parts of Sierra Leone in extreme poverty zones deserve a part of the Ministry of Education's budget. I do a lot of budget analysis in Ghana and Nigeria and other places, and honestly, the wage bill is the factor. It usually comes to 110% of expenditure every year. So we have no lever in terms of having extra financing apart from teacher salaries and the wage bill. So there is very little left in the education budgets for programs like accelerated education. And over the government has committed to about 1% of its basic education budget going to this, but they were unable to realize that. So in the case of Ghana, we have this year less than 0.05% going to the CB program, which is complementary basic and non-formal, and they can only afford to do 5,000 children. And there's close to 1 million children out of school this year. So budget priorities are embedded in formal education systems. The vast majority of these budgets are focused on teacher salaries. Areas who do not receive and sustain teachers are therefore not able to access the education budget and have not a very strong organized voice. And that comes usually we're talking about parent-teacher associations, school management committees, and what have you. The non-formal budgets and lines are less than 1% across these countries and require that there has to be a level of non-salary expenditures being committed to those programs. Civil society voice is also weakening in some cases on the out-of-school issue because it has not been given enough support by development partners nor government to strengthen it, and also in its own way of sustaining its own programming. What are some of the lessons? over the last few years, the evidence base that we've been trying to develop has helped us to do about 3 things. Setting up an enabling environment within the context of each country. So in the case of Ghana, we have a policy learning working group that's chaired by the chief director. In most cases, the closest person next to the Minister of Education is chairing that committee. We're working with the Accelerated Education Working Group. We're trying to use leveraging both internationally and locally to bring the attention of these. We've also had strategic points in which we've been sharing the evidence with governments. The UN's Transformative Summit in New York was used, the Continental Education Strategy right now for the AU. We're using that moment to share evidence with those key stakeholders. Finally, we're working closely with civil society. Even though it's weak, even though it's small, it's still, we are very much working with the coalitions in the countries, and we're now looking at working with coalitions in Canada because we need to work together on the issue. The second pathway to education clearly needs to be financed and supported. Finally, we're providing the evidence on scaling and what the cost of that scaling is. Recently, when we did the studies, we're now looking at the cost of governments not investing. In the case of Nigeria 4 years ago, it was about $40 billion for not investing in the out-of-school challenge. And today, that is probably doubled. We're just about to do the research because this last year of IDRC work, we're going to be looking at the cost of not investing. In the Ghana government, in the case of Ghana, we did the plan and it looked like it was only 12.5 million for the next 4 years to address the out-of-school challenge and reduce that number from 1 million to less than 100,000 children out of school. So when we don't invest, there's a social and economic impact of not investing in those contexts, increasing instability, youth disaffection, and what have you. So that evidence base is growing and we're building momentum. We're hoping to have a workshop with key policymakers in June across the 3 countries in probably Ghana. And we've had some real outcomes to this project. Most importantly, the Minister of Education in Sierra Leone read a few of the evidence pieces and committed significant resourcing to collaborating with the NGO sector on implementing AEPs in Sierra Leone. That was a big win. It was not just our program, but with several others that we were working with to bring that about. In Nigeria, we can see that the Nigerian government is taking this very seriously, and they're working with the Accelerated Education Working Group, our teams on the ground, and we're hoping for some breakthroughs in states like Borno, where there's a high propensity for out-of-school children. And again, USAID and others are on the ground looking at how we can fit it into their local plans and what have you. So finally, just to end on this, that the cost savings to government of using the second pathway for accelerated education is vital. It's clear formal education systems are not available in most of these cases. They're in junior high school level, you're looking at 3-kilometer walking towards getting children to go to school in some of these areas. And at the same time, they cannot support themselves because of their basic needs not being met at the homestead. Financing and implementing of AEPs needs sustained and adequate financing to reduce the number, but it needs a coordinated effort. And so I'm really hoping that GPE and others will use this as part of their frameworks for investment in the countries they're working in. Thank you.
All right, that works. All right. Wow, thank you for such nice choreographed and impassioned presentations. I'm going to take a slight sidestep to what we've been talking about and talk about why do we fund research about scaling impact. So I'm Tricia Wind, program leader for a program that sits within the International Development Research Center. So you might know IDRC, an agency of the Canadian government that supports research on a variety of different topics, including education across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And this partnership with GPE, which is the big basket fund, right, to which all kinds of governments and foundations put financing to basically provide core funding to education ministries and systems in the world's low and middle income countries. GPE decided that we needed an evidence arm. We needed a mechanism through which countries could share best practices across, share challenges and mutual learning, and provide more ready access to really relevant evidence and innovation to make a dent in some of these major issues that we see in education. So that's what CICS is. CICS is the knowledge and innovation of exchange for and of the countries that are supported through GPE. And just I'll only do one slide about what it is. CICS has a goal that is tied directly to the GPE goal. So the goal of CICS is that GPE partner countries have and use the evidence they need to achieve the GPE goal, which is to increase access, improve learning outcomes, and enhance gender equality through equitable, inclusive, and resilient education systems. And the triangle on the screen shows how it works. A key function of CICS is to help low and middle income countries learn from one another. So practitioners, people who work in ministries of education or in the local education groups in GPE partner countries have a mechanism for learning exchange through 4 regional, you can think of them as practitioner networks or policy networks. They can learn from one another on the issues that they identify as being super important. And we've heard in West Africa that the issue of out-of-school children is one of the top priorities that they have. But in across all the other regions, you'll see a strong emphasis on teacher professional development, on strengthening data systems and data use, on gender equality and inclusion in education, or especially on early childhood education as well. So these are the topics that bubble up from the view of those who are working in today's education systems about what are their top priorities. So the learning exchange facilitates engagement of people who have something to share with some people who want to learn. So you can see examples where, for instance, one country is making really good progress in doing inclusive learning assessments during COVID. And they organize a webinar such that countries around can ask questions about how did you do that? How are you integrating children with disabilities in your learning assessment approaches? Very practical, tangible kinds of things where countries who have something to share can share it with those who want to learn. The priorities that I identified through the learning exchange inform calls for applied research that we as IDRC organize. And this is the kind of applied research that Leslie has been talking about. There's a new thing that we're starting where we're trying to organize evidence and capacity strengthening for country support. So when countries have particular policy moments or, let's say, moments in the GP funding processes where evidence is needed, that especially through the regional hubs, we're able to provide more tailored support to the evidence needs in the different countries. So I'm going to talk about the applied research. And I must say, every time I'm in a university environment, I'm reminded of the importance of specifying a little bit more. When we say research, what do we even mean? So in CICS, the research that we support responds to those very immediate priorities of country governments and of practitioners in the education sector. So this is not patient research. This is impatient research. This is we need answers really soon, and we want to use that evidence very soon. So this is the kind of research that takes today's policy priority and tries to figure out in the context of a couple of years of research project, what difference can we make in this? I love blue sky research. I love big diagnostic surveys. I love impact evaluations. But what we're trying to do in CICS is just a different kind of research. It's research that takes what is already working in education systems to address some of these major challenges, and how can we scale the impact of that? So it's in some ways kind of a knowledge mobilization research question. We already know something works. We already know it's either promising or proven. What does it take to adapt it? What does it take to make it work for different people who are not included yet? What would it take to help it connect in with the larger education system? So that's the nature of the research that we fund. And generally all the projects that we fund have 3 interconnected objectives: to generate knowledge for and about scaling, strengthen the capacity of project relevant stakeholders to, let's say, participate in innovative approaches, to adapt them, to make sure that
these approaches are really grounded in context and relevant, and also strengthen the capacity to use the evidence that is being generated. And then the third objective is always about to mobilize that evidence for policy and practice. And that is built in. It's generally not a research project that sits in a desk and does work for 3 years and then pops its head up and says, oh, who could use this? This research is all about starting with use in mind and building in use as it is developing. And that includes stakeholder engagement, but it also sometimes includes co-production of research with stakeholders. So I'm going to get a little bit more into scaling, research for scaling. And you'll have heard some of this with Leslie, where Leslie is not so interested necessarily in just do these systems work? Does the complementary basic education work? That is absolutely important. But how can we help move this from little NGOs to something that gets financed, to something that can grow? So the rationale for scaling research is that there are way too many isolated pilots. There's a patchwork of great positive practice, but if it doesn't scale, then we will never make a dent in the large issues that are facing education and ones that are frankly becoming more and more critical. So a lot of pilots are not built for scale. A lot of pilots are built, and again, I'm going to go back to research because I'm standing here in a university. A lot of research is intended to really make the most perfect pilot and to understand a context and build something that's beautiful and that works. But if we don't attend to issues of moving past what works and what could work at scale, or what would it take to implement it at a larger scale, we don't actually provide the best service that we can as researchers. So we want to open up the black box of implementation and to go past a research mindset that has been, I think, quite typical. A research mindset is often, let's figure out a problem, let's figure out a pilot, let's test the pilot, let's show that it works, and then we'll hand it over, and it can be implemented by a whole bunch of implementation agencies. And that's the part that often, that's where it all falls apart. Maybe because a great initiative, and let's just take one that we probably all know, the Teaching at the Right Level, which is a fabulous approach that was built in Asia to help children catch up toward grade level by providing alternative outside school instruction, fully surrounded by NGOs and project supports. Fantastic. And all across the world, people look at that program and think that is so good. Let's figure out how to make it work in a national education system. And that's where it no longer works, because teachers are not trained necessarily to do that approach. They're trained to teach the curriculum that they have in front of them. And so there's a lot of things that really have to be unpacked when you think about how to transition something from a pilot project into into implementation and for scaling. And we also need really real-world research that engages knowledge users as it develops, so that it is relevant and that it can be used fairly immediately. So we have not only a set of projects that are looking at particular contexts and particular topics, like the ones that I mentioned, including out-of-school children, but also teacher professional development. And we're looking both within the projects and across them to figure out what can we learn about scaling impact. Not only are we looking at the experience of projects like Leslie's, but also doing complementary research to understand how government decision makers understand scaling, what matters to them, how do they think about options in front of them as they have to decide what to invest in, what to scale, or how to do so. So some of the findings that are coming out of this broad research about scaling impact in education challenge, I think, again, some of this, how do we organize research? Because a lot of the research that gets funded is about the innovation and is about how to make the innovation fabulous, really understanding the impact of the innovation. But if you would just go to government decision makers about how fabulous the results are, it's surprising how oftentimes it's not taken up. And part of what this research is showing us, research about scaling, is that the fit of an innovation in its context is actually way more important to decision makers than just the bald results of the innovation. Which means we have to organize research differently. We have to organize research that's not just focused on developing innovative approaches and testing them, but really thinking about context and building in links and contextual nuance and connection in how initiatives actually develop. Another thing that comes through strongly in our experience and in thinking about scaling is that, again, we tend to want to have excellent results and could build out an innovation in a more and more complicated way to get better and better results. And that is a really normal thing to want to do. However, if you're thinking about scaling, simplifying is way more important than perfection. And there was one quote from a man named Larry Cooley, who's thought a lot about scaling in different kinds of contexts, and he said something like, if you can simplify your innovation by 50% and only lose 20% of the impact, it's a good deal, you should take it. So we see this in a lot of the projects that we're funding. I'll give you one example. There's a project where it's a support for adolescent girls to finish their education and to provide life skill training. It's called the Learner Guide Program. It's been developed through an NGO called CAMFED across a number of different African countries, and it is a really nice program, has had very good evaluation results. In Tanzania, the secondary school system wishes to integrate the Learner Guide program as part of secondary school. And so there's a scaling trajectory in that where it would be taken up into secondary school, and the curriculum, the life skills curriculum that was being developed by that initiative is actually going to become part of the secondary school. Fantastic. So this research that we're supporting is help build evidence and insight into how to make that scaling happen. Two other countries are rather interested in scaling it, but they're not convinced that they want the entirety of the Learner Guide program as it is. And I love the openness of CAMFED and the researchers involved to say, well, of course, it doesn't have to be the whole package. What are the key parts of this that would scale in Zambia and Zimbabwe? What would be the way that this could bolt into your systems that would be different than in Tanzania? And the research is organized in a way that the people from the Zambian and Zimbabwean ministries of education are also talking to the Tanzanian ministries of education in the context of this research to understand what was your decision making, how are you going about that. You know, we have a different context in Zambia. In fact, they don't want to build this into secondary school so much as into their national volunteer policy, because there's a mentorship aspect that goes in there. So they're really thinking about what are the key elements of this that make something work, and what would, in understanding the simplification of this, how could this scale in Zimbabwe and Zambia? So there's a lot of inter-country learning, a lot of peer exchange from practitioners facilitated through research. There's a lot of co-production in that whole research process itself too, where people from ministries of education are actually participating in the research and have moved from being an audience for research in the first couple of years to actually presenting the research themselves. By year 3, it is people from the ministry that is saying, here's this project and this is what we're learning. And I think this handing over ownership of research and knowledge is another key part in knowledge mobilization. We know too that when you're thinking about scaling, understanding costs is absolutely critical, and we are not really good at doing that in education research. Partly because it's hard. There's a lot of nuance into cost studies to really understand. A lot of cost studies that come out are actually not comparable one to another because of all of the assumptions that people make as to what to include or what to not include. Sometimes it's hard to get cost data when things are, have privacy issues and, people's salaries and such. It can be very difficult to understand cost data. But decision makers need to understand. And when people like Leslie can show this program provides these results at this cost, or this is the cost of inaction, that is really part of a calculus to make a case for scaling and about scaling, and to understand costs at different scales. I'm not going to go too much into these issues of equity, but certainly scaling is easy in certain contexts, and it's not easy in other contexts, and equity costs. To really scale toward places that are hard to reach, or to understand how to nuance innovative approaches such they really grapple with those who have been excluded, and what would it take to make them included. All of this can be packaged into research for scaling. So then I'm just going to leave you with a couple of things that we're still working on because our thinking about scaling is going to continue for the next couple of years. So this is some of our ongoing research agenda, is about thinking about scaling in different subdomains. Scaling in teacher professional development, where there are national systems of teacher training and in-service or pre-service teacher support, is quite different than scaling data systems or scaling in early childhood education, which is often a public-private partnership type model. So understanding scaling in different subdomains of education is something that we will continue to work on. Always want to be mindful that scaling is not just about scaling up or scaling over or scaling out. Sometimes it's scaling deep, where there is in fact pieces of innovative approaches that are happening, but system integration is not happening. Or things that are trying to be rolled out at a national level, really what makes a difference is the district level implementation. And so the scaling deep mindset pushes us to think about what else needs to happen at different levels of an education system such that transformative change could actually happen. We want to understand continually government dynamics and mindsets around decision-making for scaling, and the role not just of high-level decision makers and policy makers, but really understanding middle tier decision makers and their influence, their authorities, and how to build scaling champions, as well as just understanding what their priorities are when it comes to scaling. And I don't know if any of you have been noticing, but we've had a number of different calls for proposals in the last couple of months, and we will be bringing in a whole new sets of projects into this endeavor about scaling research, and we'll be understanding more their perspectives and building, I'm sure, new questions for ourselves from them. So that's that.
Thank you, all three. Those are very interesting and complimentary presentations. I'd like to open the floor. We have about 15 minutes. If people would like to ask a question or make a comment about the challenges that have been presented to us, the floor is open. Okay.
Hi, Chris. I'm the Global Health Office at the University of Calgary. Thanks for a great discussion. Robert, you started laying the foundation for this, and all of you filled in a bit more about the challenges in education around the world and the problems when children don't get good education and the impact for the future, and the difficulty of building on any of that when they start with that deficit. I'm wondering if any of you would speak to examples of countries that are doing this well, that have, you gave a couple examples of specific programs, but like governments that have taken this on and changed their systems that maybe you use when you're making the case in West Africa, where it's, the government has been involved in investing in it, building systems up, and that's worked. So which countries are those, and what kind of things have they done that made a big impact and changed?
Leslie, you want to
Sure, I
take that
can
one?
take that. Ethiopia and Mali come to my mind. Ethiopia, because the Ethiopian government took the program of speed schools and did something, as Trish said, tried to put it into their own system. And instead, I mean, parts of Ethiopia are now running, instead of 6 years of primary, they're running 3. And the Ethiopian government is supporting it institutionally and financially. But there is a donor there. It's a, an impact investor. The other one is Mali. Mali's government has really demonstrated the commitment to accelerated education for 25 to 30 years. They were the first ones on the ground with it. 30 years ago, UNICEF went in, I think, well, maybe 20 years. UNICEF went in with a very small pilot on accelerated education. And that was the be-all and end-all. And all of us in West Africa were like, wow, this is a very interesting little program. And then it just expanded and expanded. Unfortunately, Mali has not been able to, let's say, scale it up, scale it out, but it is very committed to accelerate it. Sudan, through CARE, I think, is also scaling up accelerated education. Oh, sorry, Somalia, Somalia's government and CARE, through USA funding, is practically I mean, I think this is pretty much more than the formal system. Accelerated education is working in Somalia at a larger level. It's really the bigger pathway because it's a situation of conflict. But I do, yeah, there are good examples. Speed schools are definitely, Burkina Faso is looking at it. There's other countries around West Africa that are taking speed schools quite well because Norway is behind it. There's a very large Norwegian NGO promoting it. And so we're getting some level of uptake in West Africa on speed schools.
Does anyone else have a nomination they want to mention? Okay. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that so important topic of half of school children. And, just talking from my back home country, Afghanistan, with the current situation of ban school for girls over 6th grades, and this is the only country in the world, among all countries, even Islamic countries, that this ban is imposed on girls. But what will be an innovative approach to deal with that situation? Because education cannot wait. We lose years, and then there is some scatter or lessons learned from COVID, the digital learning, but still there was some foundation or government or something classroom was there, but here is nothing. So what will be an innovative approach to deal with such situation? Thank you.
Oh, I don't know. I mean, so many organizations have been kicked out. The alternative education providers are just can't. I think that is one of the most difficult situations. I think you would know more than.
Yeah, because it's a more of political. They use it as a political tool just running something or being the faculty government. But still, what will be the international community to advocate or bring that topic alive? It still is important.
One method that we tried in Sierra Leone just before COVID was girls' learning circles that are informal.
Yeah.
And they are often, girls' learning circles are just maybe 5 or 6 kids, not very much, but they're between the ages of 10 and 15, the window of hope. You can't do everything in Afghanistan, we know that. So there's a certain target group that might need to really be focused on. And the 10 to 15-year-old age, I know that's a very delicate age, but one that is non-intrusive might be learning circles where children, if they're given permission by the authorities, that maybe they could do some kind of sharing, and it is in local language. These programs are, just basic literacy, but they're not going to school. Yep. They're in a home. They're in usually one home in the community, and there are 5 or 6 girls that gather for like 2 hours a day, and it can be in the times when they're not working or they're not needed in the home, maybe at night. But it should be something that the authorities accept. And so girls' learning circles, there's a lot written in Pakistan on them. There's a lot in Sierra Leone. Purposeful International promoted them. CAMFES promoted them. There's different kind. I can try to get you some data on this.
Well, since child marriage is also increasing this situation, we really need at least a woman, a young adolescent, to be a good mother or a good wife, at least to be prepared with something, because unfortunately they get into the marriage life, and then since they are still child and no any basic education, so this is something really think of. Yeah. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
Angelina Lorenzi from Children Believe. My question is, what can civil society organizations do? Like, we work in north of Ghana with children in and outside the classroom. And we do participate, for example, with government networks on early childhood education policy. And we could also get plugged into this. I'm really grateful for this. They were such informative presentations. I wonder if we could get access to them, by the way. How can we support, with our local partners, because we implement directly, but we also work with our local partners. How can we support that? Is there a way in a country like Ghana to, through activism of civil society to basically influence the government, and then have the new information about changing approaches to international aid in Ghana that we are hearing about, how might this impact what we are talking about?
I talked a lot about the trickle-down idea, that there's, one beautiful donor who's going to wake up and say, okay, let's do this collectively, and then let's get the government to buy in. Well, we, after 3 years, decided, let's go for the bottom up. So what we did was the last year, that's year 3 of the KICS program, we went to the community and to the elders, because what we saw in our last year of research was that the facilitators for AEPs were lying dormant. They were in their communities, but they weren't working as AEP facilitators anymore. And these are volunteers. These are youth that are out of senior high school, that didn't go to tertiary, but they know how to read and write, and they know how to read and write maybe in their local language, and they still want to volunteer. They're mentoring, they're coaching, they're supporting those kids that went through the APs, but the APs, the accelerated programs, are shut down in Nigeria and Ghana and what have you. Well, we found that the facilitators are still mentoring and coaching these kids. So we asked the chiefs and elders, well, why don't you support them? And the chiefs and elders said, we will, but we need NGOs. We're a research company. We're not interested in going out and trying to start this process. So we've been talking to NGOs in northern Ghana and in northern Nigeria to see whether they could start that bottom-up approach. And through the evidence base, we're starting to build momentum. And I think it would be great for, it's Child Believe? Children Believe, yes. Children Believe, yeah. I know it is CCF. But basically, we would be very happy to bring you on board as one of the collaborators, because those 3 NGOs in northern Ghana, one of them is a faith-based NGO that is practically doing this free of charge in a very remote area, Gilbit, the Ghana Institute of Linguistics and Bible Studies. Now, they've been sustaining their program with very little financing in one of the most deprived extreme poverty zones I've ever seen, Maduri, if you've ever been out there. There's hardly any roads out there. So all to say, it doesn't cost very much. It's less than about $40. We've, per child that it's run through faith-based or localized NGOs. But it would be great. I think in your areas in northern Ghana, you can support this type of program through that dialogue, through that consultation, and we can help you through the evidence base to bring that about.
Okay. My PhD thesis research is on Ghana and the district offices in Ghana. And one of the things that we found would be, so the district's really important because they're the main feeder between the system and the schools. Districts have a lot of formal mechanisms to engage the community, to engage schools, and these things don't happen because they don't have the funds to pay the food that they need or the per diems for people to come. And so it's crazy, but they have, school performance appraisal meetings where they bring the community to talk about school performance. There are, at the circuit level, there are district assembly meetings. These things aren't happening. And so, but what I've seen is that, for example, a UNICEF program called STARS, they had a little bit for districts to facilitate these meetings. And then these meetings happened. And then they talk about, of course, what's relevant to that program, but then all the other concerns. So local NGOs that have these very small funds can work through the system to convene these meetings that can discuss some themes that are relevant to you, but also just help the district and help the system have this engagement with the community. So lots of districts that I visited were pilots of an inclusive education program by UNICEF or the USA Learning Program, and you could see that their mindsets had shifted. They thought differently about the way they work with schools. So I would echo Leslie's saying that local NGOs working really make a difference in delivery and can really integrate into the system of the district. And when you have a district director who believes in the work that you do, that can be that bottom-up champion for you. So I would say keep going, and if you can integrate with districts, I think that would be really great. If I can add to this, because it is so important to understand the desires and the possibilities for system coordination. There are expectations that countries that are partners through the Global Partnership for Education have a functioning local education group that should meet, that should be a forum for the education system led by the ministry, but inclusive, to come and debate together, that they should have joint sector reviews, that they should have a say in developing policy or reviewing policies. But those systems don't happen if people don't know about them and if they don't show up. And I think we are not yet at a point where research is systematically brought into local education groups, particularly national research. So there's a lot of work to do, but the ideas are there, and sometimes I love these examples where, you know, it doesn't take a whole lot to actually make those meetings happen, and in certain countries they could actually be the inclusive policy dialogue space that they are meant to be. But it is a matter of mobilizing and showing up, because that can be seen as tangential to your work, right? If you see yourself as an implementer or you see yourself as a researcher, you might say, yeah, well, that's just, you know, whatever. You know, like, that's an important meeting, but I don't have time. It's not going to work, right? The system coordination is not going to work until we figure out how to be the inclusive dialogue space that it needs to be.
I think we have time for perhaps one more question or comment. I have one if there isn't another. I don't know if, Tricia, you're the right one to ask this, but you others feel free to weigh in. And that is, so GPE is a global multilateral institution funded by donors. I'm wondering, again, referring back to my cynical comment at the beginning, like if foreign donors are going to look after this, that's great. How do you see a migration from a kind of externally supported, donor-supported thing, even if it's through multilaterals like GPE, towards some kind of local uptake? I know that, just one last nuance to add, GPE does put conditionalities on its participation in a given country, including enhanced education budgets. So there seems to be an acceptance of this kind of pressure.
Well, I wish I remember the number off the top of my head, but the vast majority of education system funding is national. It is not international. So education systems in countries are not run by donors. And we need to be aware then that the supports need to be for the national systems to work. And then the financing by the World Bank or by GPE, you know, should be feeding into what they decide as the priorities for their entire education system, of which then the GPE funding comes in for just a piece of it. But certainly that is not only the model and the desire, but that is the reality. And therefore, understanding, you know, how those systems work and how these complementary things run by NGOs or multilaterals have to bolt in and not be sort of projectized aspects off to the side. And I think that is maybe one of the things that I like best about GPE, is that it is trying so hard to coordinate all these international financing efforts to the top priorities that are identified by countries, as opposed to saying, you know, you can have your project over there, you can have your project over there. That coordination is almost their most cherished value, and such a challenging thing to do. So that said, you know, GPE is also a body that tries to articulate what good practice would be in helping national governments lead in identifying their policy areas for investment, and having these local education groups that actually work, and having joint sector reviews that are actually inclusive. So they try, in the way that they, you know, set out expectations for, if GPE financing comes, it comes with these expectations that this is what's there. There's a lot of just needing to come alongside whatever is there and trying, you know, to push forward. But at least I think on paper the model is a good one.
Thank you very much. Any last comments from Chairman or Leslie?
I would just like to add to the fact that we need much more parental voice in the education sector in Africa. Areas that we're talking about are very marginalized, where government where government officials often cannot go. These are areas of northern Nigeria and northern Ghana where our central governments don't have a lot of presence. And where they do, as Sheena mentions, they need support to get out to them. Now, the NGO sector, in many cases in Sierra Leone, are going to these areas. They're interacting with parents that have a preference often for accelerated education because they've seen the difference between formal schools that are not necessarily functioning and then alternative education systems that come and go. So it's a real quagmire because that voice is not being heard strong enough. So in Ghana's case, I think what we're trying in some ways to do is civil societies organizing, what we call school management committees are now becoming regional, parent-teacher associations are becoming regional, and once those associations start to make a voice, then they will hear that these priorities and these needs are still there. I don't think building a new school in very remote areas of Ghana is very feasible right now. Because as I mentioned, the majority of the budget is going to wage. The wages, what we see in the Ghanaian context is that more teachers are in urban settings and not in rural areas because they just can't live there. It's so difficult. So the question now is, which voice is going to be heard? And I think that it needs a lot more support for civil society.
Okay, thank you very much. Last comment of the day to you, Sheena.
Yeah, opening the black box of implementation. I mean, my research in Ghana showed that, there could be a super convincing teaching at the right level, whatever program. When you go and you talk to district officers, district education officers, they have no money to visit schools. They receive their operational budget 6 months late. They have to work 6 months out of pocket. They don't have money to buy paper. They don't have money to put gas in their motorbikes to visit schools. So you can have the best project in the world, and in fact, often too much research is focused on one reform. How does this reform work or this reform work? But districts, district officers, teachers, they have to take all the reforms, all this loose change, and then make something coherent out of it at the end of the day. And I think there needs to be more research and understanding that whenever you're thinking about scaling up or implementation on the daily realities of these implementers and how they're trying to do that. Because there's just no way that you can implement anything if you can't even get out to visit schools. I mean, one of the districts was begging for paper from the high school because the high schools are better funded in Ghana than the district offices. I mean, and this is just so basic, but we're not talking about it. And we're thinking like, why are schools not having textbooks or doing these things? And like this really obvious stuff that we could be fixing and helping these really passionate implementers and education professionals do their job better.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank our presenters, and this was very interesting, and we appreciate the time you've taken to travel all the way from Africa to talk to us today. So thank you very much.